All right, welcome to today's educational program, Cybersecurity for the Power, Oil, and Gas Industries, Threat, Challenges, and Solutions, brought to you by IoT World and sponsored by Trend Micro. I'm Lucian Fogoros, I'm the co-founder of IoT World, and together with Greg Orloff, our Senior Analyst and Chief Innovation Officer, will be your host for this virtual conference. And I'd like to thank you for joining. Our co-founder, Karolina Rudinsky, will monitor the online channels, so feel free to send your question in the chat line or via social channels using the hashtag #ICS_IIoT. Greg?
Great. Thank you, Lucian, and welcome everyone. IIoT World is a digital media publication that covers the economic and technological implications of the transformation taking place in the industrial IoT proliferates throughout the enterprise. IIoT World combines journalistic coverage with data analysis to expose the stories, players, trends, and innovations that shape the IIoT. IIoT World has recently ranked by K-Core Analytics as the #1 global influencer on several topics that include industrial IoT, smart manufacturing, ICS security, SCADA, predictive analytics, and predictive maintenance. IIoT World's mission is to help companies create a culture of innovation and connect the smarts, industrial technology, manufacturing, sensors, and the CXO decision makers. Today we have an exciting panel presentation representing companies such as Trend Micro and Baker Hughes, a GE company. In this roughly 1-hour virtual conference, we will discuss cybersecurity threats, challenges, and solutions in the power and oil and gas industries with speakers from the two companies. The first session title is Feel the Flow, where water and energy industries are most vulnerable. Our speaker is Robert McArdle, Director of FTR Cybercrime Research at Trend Micro. In this session, you'll hear our speaker will provide a quick overview of their recent study where they reviewed millions of endpoints from companies self-classified as energy, oil and gas, and utilities. They'll also reveal how most vulnerable were mid-tier organizations as larger organizations could afford many layers of defense, dedicated information security teams, and also incorporated regular security efforts. Robert is a director in Trend Micro's forward-looking threat research team, where he is involved in analyzing the latest cybercrime threats, specializing in researching the future threat landscape, open source intelligence, OSINT, and coordinating investigations with international law enforcement. Robert is a regular presenter for the press and at security conferences. He also lectures in malware analysis and cybercrime investigations on MSc modules at Cork IT and University College Dublin, UCD. He worries that his hobby and job are one and the same and constantly wonders if normal people have this problem. Someday he hopes to find a strange niche area of cybercrime that means his years of reading Star Wars trivia will have some impact on his day job. So welcome, Robert, take it away.
Thanks very much. And I promise there's no Star Wars references in the slides, or at least I haven't coded any in so far. So let's get started here. So we should have, right click. Great. So if we look at the media today, or when you regularly read stories in the media about industrial IoT and exposed critical infrastructure online, a lot of the stories like this type of thing will spring out to you. So what we would call FUD, or fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and generally kind of overhyped or a little bit OTT type stories compared to the reality of what we actually see. So to clarify, we have seen attacks on these industries, and we continue to see not just exposed, but actually vulnerable systems in critical infrastructure sectors, but they're not always where people might actually suspect them to be. So that's what I'm going to clarify a bit today. So of all these sectors, perhaps more than any other ones, the energy and water industries are critical to the economy of every nation on earth, and in fact, actually to human life, really. And as such, all the critical infrastructure sectors, they're the most important to secure. Because as everyone here knows, water isn't just, for example, a resource for drinking and food, and energy isn't just the power that you get from your actual, from the electricity in your house. It feeds into all of these other infrastructures around it. And if you take either of those out, it has a knock-on effect on all of them. So that importance was really the motivation for Trend Micro to release a paper on this subject at the end of last year. And when talking about the risks against these sectors, it's important to first think about, firstly, one, has there been real attacks in the past? Secondly, are there any currently vulnerable systems online? And then third, what trends can we expect in the future? So today I'll cover all three of these, plus some advice on defending such systems for those of you in these sectors, or specifically in the energy sector. And all of this is covered in our paper. I'll include a link in the notes, which will be sent out after the actual presentation. And today I'm going to give more of an overview of the topic, but also available for lots of Q&A afterwards, any questions that you might have. So we'll start really quick with a quick reality check for all the doom and gloom stories. So is there evidence of attacks against the energy, or I say energy and water because that's what the paper is on, but is there attacks against the energy industry to date? Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely there is. If you're a person who follows the news for so-called APT or sophisticated target attacks, you'd be forgiven for thinking these sort of things happen on nearly a monthly basis, but in reality, that's not really the case. So sure, the sector does get hit by targeted attacks every single year, but this will mostly be targeted phishing attacks against the traditional IT networks of the organization. This is a bit out of scope for what we're going to talk about today, because after all, every big organization gets phishing attacks. If you're a big organization, you have big amounts of money, and therefore a big opportunity for an attacker. But one thing that's worth highlighting here, however, is the sort of malware that we see targeting the energy and water industry. So when we were compiling our report, we came up with a top 20 of malware that we saw affecting our customers who had self-identified themselves as being part of either the energy or the water industry. And there's a lot, what's interesting here is there's a lot of run-of-the-mill malware in there, but some of them should be very worrying. So in particular, so the first one here, Sality, is a file infector from at least 2 years ago with some variants as old as 8 years. And it's commonly detected when people move infected files from some other system to one where our security software be installed. Then the WCry one, you see, that's a WannaCry, which everyone should know about. And that used a patched vulnerability from 2017, commonly known as Eternal Blue. Then Downad is our detection for something called Configure, which is a worm that was around from 2008, but we still see infections. And then Ramnet is very similar to Sality. It's a file infector from 2010. Now, why that's important is because these are really old vulnerabilities. So if I generated a top 20 for all the world's computers, you wouldn't really expect to see most of these in there at all. But in the critical national infrastructure world, you absolutely do, because you'll often find old machines that have not and cannot be patched, which is a real security challenge for that sector. And trust me, I fully understand why it's not as simple as just saying, go patch everything. That's not a realistic option in that world. I fully get that. But how often have malware attacks like these, or those I referred to like earlier as targeted attacks in the sector, really gotten all the way to compromising the OT or the ICS network, the industrial IoT, if you like? As far as we can verify for all the APTs and so on, only about a half dozen times or so. So you had, back in 2014, you had Havix, which is also associated to Energetic Bear or Dragonfly groups. And this was one of the first to have the ability to find ICS devices on the network via an OPC scan. And in the same year, you had Sandworm, which uses zero-day vulnerability to target SCADA systems making use of GE's Simplicity HMI. Then next, the year after, Killdisk was a malware component associated to both Sandworm and another group called Black Energy. And that was the one that was famous for taking Ukrainian power grid offline, or at least a section of it. In 2016, not long after, there was reports of an Iranian hacking group that targeted a number of small dams in the US, possibly as a test for a larger attack. And Verizon the same year reported on an incident affecting an unnamed water treatment plant in the US, resulted in altering of the chemical compositions going into it. And in 2017, you had Indestroyer and Triton. Triton in particular kind of raised the game of understanding from the attackers, because it went after these safety systems that allow for safe shutdown of the certain ICS devices in the energy industry. So not just the devices themselves, but the safety control systems that stop things going really badly wrong. And then finally, in 2018, you had the US CERT issued an advisory of alleged Russian government activity against a number of critical national infrastructure. So of course, there may be many more than this, but there is little that the security industry can do to really defend against some of those. The reason why is sharing and secrecy. So by the very nature of the sectors involved here, they can't always share information on attacks, even when they happen. And as a result, the security industry don't have useful data to work with sometimes when testing their defense models for these type of attacks. So at Trend Micro, we also validated that such systems are attacked in our own research. Back in 2013 already, we simulated a water plant at the time with some hydroelectric simulation in there as well, in a high interaction honeypot network using real programming or PLCs and real logic to make it look and appear across the network like a real plant. And again, in 2015, we simulated a number of gas stations, which is not directly linked to energy or water, but just wanted to show you that it is an industrial control type system. So in the water plant experiment, every single one of our 12 setups was actually hacked, with 15% of them being critical, which means that it would have actually had negative effect had it been a real plant. So to summarize so far, we have attacks against these sectors do happen, including ones specifically crafted for them and the sorts of devices and systems they might have. The majority of these come from highly sophisticated or possibly even state-level actors, but as we'll see in a moment, that's not the only real area for concern. So all of these attacks were in the past, but how vulnerable is the world today is what we want to know. So the core part of our recent research focused on determining what sort of vulnerable systems exist on the internet for these sectors today, and what would be the realistic result if one of those is compromised. And it's important that we're looking here for vulnerable systems, not simply exposed systems. Just because something's accessible on the internet doesn't mean it can be successfully attacked. And there are many valid reasons to expose a critical system online, and if it's done securely, it mightn't be an actual issue. So we want to be very realistic in terms of working out attack models and effects for these systems, because as I said earlier at the very start of the presentation, there's enough kind of overblown publications in this area that do more harm than good, quite frankly. Okay, so with that in mind, we adopted two main approaches to doing this. The first was internet scanning, and the second was geostalking. So for internet scanning, the approach should hopefully not be used for many people here. It simply involves scanning the entire internet, or specifically IP version 4 addresses, for a variety of different protocols that are related to OT equipment and HMIs. So for example, protocols like DNP3 or Modbus or BACnet or various vendor-specific ones. And we list a whole bunch of the different ports that we looked at in the paper. For HMI in particular, you can also craft some Google searches to find interfaces with particular keywords exposed. And we also looked at HMI that were exposed via VNC or kind of remote desktop type protocols by using OCR scanning on the images that Shodan could capture, which is how we actually went about doing it. So we partnered with Shodan on this, leveraging their existing scan results, plus adding some additional in-house functionality on top of all that. And the reason I said that this shouldn't be news to anyone is that the idea of scanning the internet for exposed devices with Shodan has been around for a long time. So the first presentation there was from DEF CON in 2010, next one from Black Hat 2012, and then DEF CON 2013. And you'll find loads of papers, including some from Trend Micro, that reference the tool. So in other words, any organization in the energy sector that hasn't already tested their exposure to an internet-wide scan is at least 9 years behind at this point in terms of security. So as we'll see in the results, unfortunately, there's still a lot exposed, and unfortunately, very vulnerable devices that are still out there. But just in case you're not familiar, here's one example search. Here I was just doing a search, this is for more for a water thing, but I searched for the phrase ullage, which is the amount of space or air left in a tank, in a containment tank, on a specific port. And the 5,241 results you see here are mostly gas stations, but also some other liquid containment vessels that you find as well for water or other materials. And of each of these results, what an attacker would then normally do is carry out a more complete port scan of the system, so not just of the device, but neighboring IP addresses as well, before moving into actually compromising the device. In other words, checking if it's vulnerable as well as being exposed. So our second technique then is a bit of a newer one, which we call geostalking. And in this case, the idea is you start by determining the physical location of a target facility, and then you work backwards to find its IP address. So while it's not possible in every case, it certainly was in enough cases that it was useful for the research. So essentially two steps. First, step one, find the physical location of the plant or energy provider you're looking for. And then the second one is map it out to an IP. So for the first part, there's a number of approaches. Several countries detail all major facilities in like energy, water, and other critical national infrastructure, as well as their geo coordinates, such as this example here from Japan. And then also to make things easier to maintain, plants are often designed with similar layouts, so we can have we can use actually a reverse map image to search tool. So this one's called Descartes Labs, and we can use it to find other plants. So the tool works by taking the location in Google Maps satellite view and then searching for similar locations around the world. And that works really well for something like, here's an oil refinery. So on the right, you can see the actual original location found, which is a Chevron facility in California. And then on the left is matches across the United States that look very similar to this sort of setup. And finally, then once you have these real world locations, you can use reverse GeoIP to try and find the corresponding IP addresses. So for example, from a company like MaxMind to provide a database for this. And to do this, we took a script that would take the initial geo coordinates. We'd search for all IP addresses in a certain radius off that point. And then we simply plug those IPs into Shodan to find likely results that would match with what we expect for the target facility. And based on those approaches, let me show you some of the results that we got back. So in the paper, we list pages and pages of different sorts of vulnerable HMI and devices, but I'll include a few. So here you can see stuff like an oil drill rig in the Middle East, or at least we assume it is. It's something that's drilling to 3,500 feet, so it most likely is. You have container tanks, things like an industrial water pumping system, oil wells, these are in the United States, biogas, and some others as well. And all of these represent very different types of systems, but they all have something in common. So have a look at them and think to yourself, what do these have in common? So the answer is they all have buttons. As in, they're exposed to the level where simply by browsing to them as an attacker, you could directly control and affect the system. And it's important to note that we only show systems that are fully open like this. We found many others behind a simple login screen or running older software that we know has remote vulnerabilities. But as researchers, we're not able to verify the strength of a login page, for example, or if a system could be remotely exploited. But those same restrictions don't apply to attackers. And that's also why we didn't include numerical stats in the paper, because they're largely meaningless. So the number of machines we find and consider vulnerable is only a fraction of what an attacker would be able to compromise using without the same ethical restrictions in place. And on top of that, this is just a fully internet exposed part. If you're serious about securing an OT network in one of these sectors that we're talking about, assume you're defending against an attacker who's already within your VPN or network and coming from a high privileged user. So we've spoken already of how successful attackers can be at phishing attacks, right? So sadly, getting inside your initial perimeter isn't as hard as you might think. So let me give you a few examples of such vulnerable systems and the actual risks that they present, not just the fact that they're exposed. So these two controls come from a water treatment plant. So out of the scope of energy, but I'll go on for a second. Specifically, one was for the sterilization of seawater. That's what the SWORO here stands for, is seawater reverse osmosis, as in turning seawater to drinking water. And a successful cyber attack against a plant like this can negatively affect the drinking water in the region or lead to things like supply shortages. And of course, impure water can also spread diseases and cause a public health issue. Then this time around, we have controls for oil and gas wells. And except for some drilling rigs that we found in the Middle East, all of the vulnerable exposed oil and gas HMI devices we found were in the United States. So using well identification data and geolocation and public info, we were able to locate all of them physically to their real locations. So our Google Maps visual investigation shows these wells were being used in one of two ways. First, to extract extracted resources were diverted to large collection sites and then transported via major pipelines. And secondly, resources were collected and sent to local power plants. So cyber attacks against these systems could therefore affect supply and have further impacts up the supply chain and heavy financial impacts. So we actually found estimates of between 100 and 300K US dollars per day as the cost of a single pump failure. So let's look at one more just in-depth example to give you a full picture of what an attacker could do. So as any Doctor Who fan will tell you, in the bottom picture on the right, this is a TARDIS that's exposed to the internet, or actually in reality it's a hydroelectric plant. So this is where kind of water and energy combine. So I want to highlight this one because it's not that there was an exposed HMI in this case, but it doesn't make it any harder to attack. So this was one system we found via our geostalking approach, which revealed IP addresses in an area that we expected to find a hydro plant. And then on one of those IP addresses, we discovered controls for a webcam. Now, a webcam normally is a privacy concern, but not as bad as an exposed HMI for something sensitive, right? But via the webcam, we could quickly verify we're dealing with a hydro plant based on the machinery being used, and we have some ICS experts in the team who've seen these in real life. And looking at the other open ports on the IP, which you can see in the bottom left, there was several ones of interest. So it had an outdated FTP server, it had a web server that turned out to be the industrial router control page, 4 webcams, some of which you can see here. It had a default outdated IIS install, again, which you can attack, and then 2 Omron control systems behind the industrial router. So for those interested in specifics, the controllers were on TCP port 9600, which is the FINS protocol, or Factory Interface Network Service, and TCP 44818, which is commonly used to configure those devices. It's Ethernet IP. And both of those would allow an attacker to interact directly with the plant equipment. And attacking such a system can have a significant real-world effect, because to make matters worse, the attackers can actually observe via the cameras in real time the effects of their attack. So check that there's no staff present, and as well as seeing the effects like things like rakes, controls changing, spill gates opening, and electricity generation, that kind of thing. So if in the vulnerable systems we found, it might be good or bad to know that the majority of them came from the kind of middle level of the energy and water sectors, not the major players. So somewhat comforting, but due to the way supply chains and dependency works, an attack on a downstream provider will still have a knock-on effect. And another important consideration is this doesn't factor in physical safety controls in any cases, in all cases, right? So these are pictures of my colleague Federico carrying out research on industrial robots, which is not directly related to water and energy that I'm discussing today. What I want to highlight here is that such robots are inside protective safety cages. Or in other words, just because an attacker can remotely hack and control something doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of physical controls or procedures in the real world that will prevent them causing harm. So those sort of attack scenarios might not play out the way we imagine them as a result of that. And you can also see the difference here between how IT and OT people generally think, right? So for IT people, a classic acronym is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, in that order. Whereas in the OT world, it's more like AIC. So availability and integrity must come first. Things cannot be allowed to fail. And that's actually one of the biggest concerns we have when making claims in a research like this, is that we want to err on the side of not being sensationalist with anything that we say. So everything so far is focused on the kind of classic attack scenarios of a target attacker taking control of the system, and then leveraging the controls for espionage or sabotage purposes. And that's a real concern, of course, but frankly, it might be a really outside your risk models, and for good reason. So one of the fundamental rules of defense is to know who you are defending against. And the types of people who would do such an attack are likely state-backed or similar in nature. And for whatever reason, your organization mightn't be on the radar of such a group, hopefully. So, however, maybe your company has a lot of hacktivist pushback for various reasons, right? So knowing that helps your organization to defend. And for me, the risk of someone taking over a system isn't the most concerning risk an organization in the sector would face. Yes, it's one of the biggest impacts, no doubt, right? But the risk of it happening is a lot lower. So there's several attacks against the same vulnerable systems that represent, in my opinion, a bigger risk. The first would be ransomware. So these are high-value targets that can't afford to be days of downtime. So they're perfect to compromise and ransom for financial gain. Secondly, you've got the denial of service hacks. So if compromise isn't possible, by the nature of them being online, they can be extorted in the same manner for DDoS attacks. Then you have use as permanent bots. So because machines in these systems are very unlikely to be noticed or cleaned up, they're perfect for long-term infections, which can actually lead to potential liability issues if they're used to attack people. Especially of interest is be used as a beachhead. So these vulnerable machines can be used to move laterally, compromise first, and then move laterally to the core of your network, which is almost a reverse scenario to what most people consider. They expect attackers to first attack the network and then move to the OT equipment, not the other way around. And lastly, of course, there's destructive attacks. So don't discount the damage that can be caused by a so-called hacktivist or script kiddie. If a professional hacker in a military unit somewhere takes over an energy plant, they're not going to cause serious harm until some high-ranking general gives them an order to do so, which will be carried out for political purposes, because the risk of repercussion or even up to an act of war is too great. But a 15-year-old hacker with access to the exact same system, trying to impress his girlfriend, or let's be honest, trying to impress his most definitely male friends, just because he doesn't like a big corporation, that guy's going to flip switches to his heart's content. So for me personally, the 15-year-old hacktivist with a chip on his shoulder represents a bigger risk than the career cyber ops military specialist any day. And worryingly, while the interest in ICS and SCADA attacks among that community isn't as big as for financial attacks, it's definitely growing, and you'll see more of that in the next year or two. So as part of our research, we also looked into these underground communities, covering the English-speaking, Russian, Latin American, Chinese, and Arabic languages. And historically, those undergrounds have put a lot of focus on attacks critical infrastructure, simply because it's a poor return of investment compared to more lucrative attacks like the banking Trojans and so on. But there's still two main categories of attackers who have an interest in that area. The first is the highly sophisticated groups you mentioned, the industrial espionage types and state-sponsored, but you wouldn't commonly find them in public forums. And the second are the more opportunistic or curious attackers who've learned of such devices through services like Shodan and Census and so on. And you'd think that there's a third category, which would be cyber terrorists, but cyber actors related to terrorism groups rarely look into exposed devices. And one reason is the skill level needed to understand and hack them is quite high. A second one is, have a quick look at this imaginary headline for a second and stop and think, what do you see when you see this? So you might feel anger or worry or concern. What you don't feel is terror, unfortunately, at least from an attacker's point of view. If it was a second headline, this is much more real world and more likely to invoke terror. So there's actually studies on this, but in general, the same disconnect that allows people to say and do terrible things online to each other that they'd never do in the real world works negatively in reverse for people trying to inflict terror through online means. So what sort of discussions about hacked critical infrastructure do we see in underground forums? Well, firstly, we see a lot of people with interest to learn more about the topic and the sorts of technologies involved. So here we see tutorials for Shodan and another one for PLCs, talking about different protocols like Modbus and so on. Going beyond that, we see some of the first signs of a more professional and commercial interest in attacking these systems. So this isn't specific to energy and water segment, it's just any IoT device, but especially SCADA, and it's called out here, but everything from a smart home camera to more industrial things. And based on the follow-on discussions on these threads, the goal of buying such access is not to modify or damage the device itself. Instead, it's to leverage the vulnerable device as an initial infection point, just like we said, to then move around the network and steal more traditional details. And also in a lot of cases, there's people selling access to critical infrastructure or data stolen from those machines. The initial attack vector was actually not intentional. So the attackers set out to infect anybody, then they managed to find a system that was in this industry, and they know the data they're sitting on is valued to someone, they just don't know who. So they try to advertise it openly in the market. And also of concern isn't just the opportunistic attackers that have to work here, but also potentially corporate espionage. So we've seen a couple of isolated cases of people looking to get information on a competitor for personal enrichment or selling data from their own company. And both of these are people, and this one, offering information on large energy providers in Russia based on a compromise of their internal network. So to summarize the underground scene at the moment, there's a little financial interest in targeting critical national infrastructure sectors, but for sure among script kiddie type level groups, they love to experiment by interacting with exposed HMIs in particular, just to see what they can do. And of course, at target attack level, those groups are heavily interested as well. So to wrap everything up at this point, we covered the fact that for sure these attacks do happen in the past. We also know that there's still, despite years of research, a large amount of vulnerable systems out there on the internet today. And we know that there's an interest level of opportunistic attackers is rising. So I would also include a section that's talking how to defend your networks, but honestly, there's actually 8 pages dedicated just to that in the paper. I suggest you read that in your own time. But I will, however, leave you with 2 pieces of advice that I think are the most important when it comes to securing yourself. The first is go hack yourself. Or in other words, go and try and find the same sort of techniques that we used against your own networks and internet-facing IP addresses. Because defending against a determined target attacker isn't easy by any means, but you definitely don't want to be the person in the news responsible for being hacked by some young hacker just pressing buttons. It's 2019, and frankly, we should be finally able to lock down those sort of cases. And then secondly, when planning your defense for an OT or ICS network, do so assuming you're defending from an internal attack from a high-ranking employee. Always assume your organization's already compromised and then build your defense models based on that. And then finally, I'd like to just thank IIoT World for inviting me on the call and end the talk with one request. So our team are very, very interested in learning more about the attacks that are really keeping all of you awake at night. And to a degree, sectors like ours are a bit of a black box, or sectors like yours, should say, are a bit of a black box to the outside world. But we're more than open to collaborate and look what you're seeing and try and enrich that knowledge. And that's not meant as a sales pitch either, although, of course, happy to put you in touch with someone. They put dinner on the table at the end of the day. But it's genuinely a request as security researchers. We want to know if we're going in the right direction with this stuff. And frankly, no one can tell us better than the types of people in this call. So that's it for me, everyone. And I'm open to any and all questions at the end of the two sessions. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was an impressive and insightful presentation. And I have to say it's a bit sobering in terms of how vulnerable the industrial world still is in terms of cyber incidents. But the parting comments were exceptional. I think it's a key thing. Go hack yourself and assume an internal attack. So we're going to move into our next session now. It's entitled Security Solutions and Best Practices for Power and Oil and Gas Industries. Our speaker is Derek Borland. He is the Senior Product Manager in Cybersecurity at Baker Hughes. Derek has over 10 years of experience in senior leadership, and he's recognized as a champion of new product design, market research, security consulting, and alliance building. He's spearheaded innovative programs, business plans, and cybersecurity strategies. Derek is repeatedly successful in driving revenue, capturing new opportunities, negotiating new alliances, and developing targeted marketing strategies. Now, in this session, you're going to hear from our speaker best practices for prioritizing your assets by value and inherent risks, maintaining the cyber health of critical assets, and protecting against various types of sophisticated threats, and choosing the right partners to assist you in your cybersecurity program that best fits with an OT technology cycle. Derek, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. And just a little about what's going on. I am in the middle of a blizzard here in Denver, Colorado. So I am on my cell phone with no power. I'm actually, go figure, like the irony of that. But so I'm going to be asking that the team from IIoT World will help me advance the slides. So next slide, please. So to give you kind of an overview of Baker Hughes and not only who we are, but why we are, right? So when you look at the different missions that we have, it all boils down to standing side by side with our customers and helping them through their innovation, right? So moving through the cycle of their business and helping them move forward. And cybersecurity, when you start talking about the connectivity, becomes a big part of that. So next slide. So a little bit of our history. We've been in the cybersecurity for about 10 years now. We have over 3 million hours of safe operation on OT assets. We operate in 45 different countries, and we protect about $10 billion of OT assets currently. So we do this through a broad portfolio of products and services that we offer out to our customers. All right, next slide. So we routinely meet with our customers and really discuss the challenges that they have on their side. So a lot of it is very specific to the customers, but a lot of it boils down to kind of these 6 different problems that our customers see, right? So the volume of expertise, right? Most of the people on site in a plant don't have the cybersecurity expertise. They are really mechanical engineers, automation engineers who have just so happened been given the task of cybersecurity, which is a tall task. Robert mentioned legacy infrastructure we see all the time. Now, there's many things that go into the legacy infrastructure, and we do understand that what problems come with upgrading systems. But a lot of times we see it as just a budgetary issue, right? So we have this legacy system, it's on this old operating system. We just don't have the budget to update it now. And they don't really take into account the security risks that come with legacy infrastructure not being able to patch. A lot of that is based on the other side is the leader support, right? So when you're talking about how cybersecurity is implemented or budgeted for the OT network, it's really a capital expenditure tied to other upgrades, whether it's control system upgrades, HMI upgrades, and those only really happen once every 10 years. So they kind of bolt on cybersecurity onto that because that's really the only budgets that at the plant level they really get. You don't really see too many in-cycle updates of cybersecurity because the leadership on the IT side doesn't understand the OT side and what they're going through. So they never really give budget for any in-cycle upgrades. Regulation challenges, I won't get too much into that because I could probably spend 25 minutes just laying out all the compliances that plant operators have to deal with without even going into them. So, but compliance regulation is, I have a love-hate relationship, and maybe we after this, if you contact me, we can sit down and have a beer and go over kind of what I feel about regulations and compliance. Constrained resources, obviously, that's everybody feels that on the OT network. Once again, that goes with volume of expertise, right? They don't have enough people to dedicate anybody specifically to cybersecurity. And then remote connections. It's a world we live in. There's many remote connections into the OT network. It really varies based on both vertical and customer to customer. But if you look at asset performance management, condition monitoring, those type of things, there are remote connections and communications in and out of the network. And also having to report or connect back to home offices or plant-to-plant communications. So that's a big sticking point for our customers. And as we move into this digital transformation, remote connections are going to become a much more likely thing, which brings in a lot more risks, but brings in a lot more rewards as well. So you have to kind of look at that from both aspects. All right, next slide. So when we're looking at risks on an OT network, and this is nothing new. If you work in a plant or work in some kind of OT network, risk is part of your job. It's something you do every day, whether it's when you're doing your safety systems, you're obviously doing risk assessments. You should be doing regular risk assessments through just the machinery and the failure points throughout. But I haven't seen too often where they're doing monetary risks, right? So if you're looking at the asset, what is that monetary cost if it does fail? We've heard anything from $10 million a day in lost production up to $50 million a day in lost production. These are the kind of things that senior leadership talks about regularly. And I think there's a disconnect there that senior leadership may not understand the value of that equipment to the business. Now, when you're talking about rotating machinery or distillation towers in oil and gas, or the Christmas tree on offshore plants, those are usually the lifeblood of any business, right? Yet we see regularly that it has less cybersecurity controls than maybe some less valuable assets at the IT level. So being able to voice how important those assets are to the business, what is the cost if they go down, really will help kind of open up some of those avenues to receive funding that is really constrained at the plant level. You also have to look at the redundancy of systems, right? Too often we say, okay, the rotating machinery or the rotating blades are the most important to your system. But say you're a black start site, right? So you have diesel generation backups in case you lose power. So there's already redundancy built in those. So now spinning up redundancies, there's cost to that, but it does lower risk a little bit. So looking at kind of what redundancies you have in place, what your safety system will do in case of any kind of attack or failure. Well, really, you have to think about that in terms of adding a finance number to your risk. And then finally, Robert mentioned it pretty well, is the talent of attackers that you see coming after your system. And unfortunately, this area of the OT network gets some of the most talented of attackers. All right, next slide. All right, so when you look at critical attack points across any kind of plant, you really have to almost look at the data integrity through your sensors, actuators, and control nodes, right? So this data is very important because through this data, actions are taken, right? So everything's really passive in an OT network. No actions are really taken automatically. But if that data integrity is compromised at the sensor, actuator, or control node level, then they could force you to take action that is detrimental. So the hack alone or the criminal alone isn't the one that's actually causing the attack or causing the destruction. It's a control operator because they have falsified data. So understanding those points through the data of the sensors is really important, and kind of protecting that communication to make sure that you have the most real-time data to make those educated decisions on, right? So it will impact your system reliability, your HSE, your safety, all those type of things. So we really look at that data integrity inside the network as being really key to protecting yourself. And sensors, it could not be a cyber attack, right? Sensors go offline. They become uncalibrated from time to time too, as well. So understanding that will help make sure that the data you have is true when it gets into a controller's wheelhouse. All right, next slide. All right, so when you look at the type of attackers, and I won't go too much into this because Robert already went into it, right? So we really look at three type of attackers that are the ones that most likely are going to be attacking a OT network, right? So you have that hacktivist side, which they tend to, their reasons are usually social reasons. It's a perceived environmental issue or other controversies in energy production or oil and gas, right? So they're a very talented organization usually. They're not a script kiddie type organization. So when you look at kind of the talent of attackers, hacktivists is up there, right? So they're very talented in what they do. Second is the nation state, right? And it's for political reasons that they're doing, and also some business reasons, right? So we've seen nation states disrupt or even steal IP, right, for business reasons, yet it was a nation state that was doing it. So they're not just going to be in there to take down a machinery when something goes awry politically, right? So they could be in there just trying to steal secrets and trying to gain an edge on the business aspect. We see that a lot in oil and gas. And then criminal, right? You have these high value machinery out there and high valuable to the customer or to the business. So there's a lot of criminal reasons to attack an OT network, right? So whether it's ransomware, whether it's DDoS, right, that Robert mentioned, there's many reasons that criminal organizations will want to get into an OT network. And unfortunately, these are very sophisticated networks of attackers. So assume, to Robert's point, that they've probably already they can get through your initial system pretty easily. So it's very important to have a good IR strategy or incident response strategy when dealing with these. All right, so when we look at the 7 strategies to defending ICS, right? So this is ICS kind of released this, and their understanding, if you implement these 7 strategies, you could block 98% of incidents in the ICS, right? So the major ones is implement application whitelisting, right? So we see that a lot more now. Back in about 2014, 2015, that was a new thing that they were just kind of starting. But now we're seeing that a lot more being implemented. And then it's traditional health of your system, right? It's your patch management, making sure everything's configured right, making sure that what assets are on your network are connected to other assets. So a lot of times we say, okay, this DCS that's protecting my distillation tower, I'm going to put the best cybersecurity controls on that because that's the lifeblood of my organization. Yet that distillation tower has network connections into your environmental system, which you may have through a risk said, you know what, that's a little bit lower, so you don't put the cyber controls on that. We see that quite a bit, that when attackers attack systems, they're not going after the high value right away. They're looking to get in any way possible, and then finding that internal highway to get to the most important assets. So you have to kind of look at those connections to kind of reduce that attack surface for your major assets. Other things coming up is managed authentication. So we don't see that a lot in the OT network, yet it plays a big role in protecting it. We've done a tour through some oil and gas companies where they give a tour to the public, yet admin passwords are on a sticky note sticking on the monitor of their HMI, right? So you have to really look at passwords, managing users, those type of things. It becomes a labor task, so a lot of times it's overlooked, right? So changing a password, removing a user, that tends to take away from the process, right? So it takes your time away from the more needed processes. So it's not done as much, but it is important when looking at the OT network. And then being able to monitor and respond, right? So when you're looking at risk, we see a lot of customers say, you know, I don't want connections outside of my 4 walls because that connection brings risk. But also not having those connections bring risk as well as how somebody can respond, right? So if you find a cyber threat and it takes 72 hours for somebody to get boots on the ground, there's a risk associated with that. And when you're doing that, make sure that if you are partnering with somebody on IR, that they know the OT network. They've worked in it before. We've seen some response teams go in and they don't have a hard hat or steel-toe shoes, so they can't even get into your facility. So really be prepared for those. All right, next slide. All right, so some mitigating the risk on some things. So if you look at it, we kind of talked about some of the problems that we've seen with customers. So one is unsupported OS on HMIs, right? So sometimes it has to do with the system. Okay, I'm not doing a controller upgrade. That's very expensive to do. My current controller software will not run on any systems but XP. Coming up on Windows 7, we're going to start losing patches for that as well. But if you kind of look at the risks of that, it is a very high to have unsupported OSs on your HMI. So just because there aren't patches available, there's no security protocols on it, and though some security companies say, okay, we can continue to put security controls on these systems, having an up-to-date OS that's being able to patch is some of the most important, just very, very basic things you can do to increase your cyber health. Next is unpatched systems, right? And we understand that patching once again, it's a tough road, right? It's very manual within an OT network. We even see now people still right to each one of the HMIs to patch those. They don't even have a centralized patching, which could take days, or they may need to, wait until the next outage, which could be 18 months before outages, before they can even patch. So we really ask that you look at having validated patches, making sure that you validate them first against a network like yours. So when you do patch, whether it's every 18 months, whether it's every month, that it's not going to break your system, right? So we've had some customers who haven't validated. They've kind of decided to self-perform, and they've actually kind of hurt their systems and created downtime because of that. Now, this isn't a cybersecurity related downtime. It's just a failure to validate the patch. And the next is just a network. Make sure that anything that's touching your network or going in and out of your network is secure before it really touches your network, right? So don't allow disparate devices without them being tested to really enter your network. So really, really pay close attention to that. All right, next slide. All right, so when looking at a long-term strategic partner for your cybersecurity, we really ask that you look at 3 different levels, right? So, and one is the industrial mindset. They understand the OT network. They've played in that space. They have purpose-built tools in that space. We see a lot of partners or a lot of solutions or a lot of products that they may put Modbus protocol on there and call it their ICS, yet they're using their traditional IT tools to still do it, right? So really look for that industrial, that they have those purpose-built tools for the OT network. Look at purpose-built technology as well, right? When you're looking at at your partners or at your partners or suppliers or what have you. And then cybersecurity expertise, right? So they have that deep understanding of not just machinery, but cybersecurity as well. So they can help you with your cybersecurity challenges. All right, next slide. All right, and then finally, I want to talk about products that are cyber secure in nature, right? So along with adding products, cybersecurity products, start looking and almost start demanding products that are purpose-built with cybersecurity. So one, we look at embedded in the design phase. So The one example of that is encryption, right? So encryption hasn't widely been used in an OT network because of the latency issues that it causes. Anytime you put encryption on any kind of network or communication, there's inherent latency in that. Yet, if you haven't looked at this for a couple years, maybe it's time to revisit that, because now you look at more control systems using multiple processors and then segmenting one single processor, a dedicated processor, to encryption. And then that way there's no latency in the IO communication or the network communications. So then you can still keep your 10 millisecond bandwidth or communication speed that you may require, while still getting the added value of encryption. And also look at encryption from the control unit up to the HMI. Latency isn't usually an issue there because you already have built-in latency, because the operator, the human on the other side, there's latency in that. But also look at that, right? So making sure that goes back to the data integrity, making sure that the data that the controller is reading or the control operator is reading is the right data. Look at secure connections to remote services. So a lot of times when you get these remote services, you look at just what they are giving you, right? So maybe it's asset performance monitoring, maybe it's condition monitoring, and maybe it's other things, or even remote connection back to your home office. But really demand that those connections are secure, and even more than just a VPN tunnel, right? So look at controlling that tunnel. Look at having a physical on and off switch at the plant so that network line isn't always open. Look at it running through, whether it's IDS, IPS, or a firewall, and don't let that line run straight into the controller, right? So make sure it's running through so you can stop any kind of connection if you need to or if you want to. And then really look at cybersecurity controls for your contractors, right? So anybody that you bring into your plant or anybody that plugs into your network, make sure that you're issuing cybersecurity controls on them. And that's more than just inspecting their cybersecurity, their health at an IT level or what have you. Trend Micro actually makes a tool that's a portable, that's their portable security, where you can just plug it into one of your contractors' laptops if they're going to bring it in, and it does a quick scan and make sure that it's virus free. So make sure that you're looking at those when you're looking at the contracts. You want to make sure that they're cyber secure on their end, and they're not bringing in anything into your site. All right, some of the key takeaways that I want to kind of go over is the world is changing, and your plants and your assets are becoming more connective, right? Because of the benefits of that. So we want to not stop that, and we don't want security to stop that transformation. We want to be able to enable it, but we want you to be able to do it securely. So please reach out and let us know what you're trying to do from a transformation or from an innovation standpoint, and what we can do for security around that. Don't assume that any outside connections or any kind of innovation you can't do because it's not cyber secure. Really reach out to people who understand your business, who can. It may be a bad idea to do, but maybe we can mitigate the risk down to where the reward is more profitable for your organization. All right, next slide. All right, and just as a final, I want to thank the IIoT team and Trend Micro for having us on. We do believe that cybersecurity in the OT network is just as a member of the human race, right? Like I want, no matter what, even if you don't choose EHG or you don't choose any of the other people we partner with, just we ask that look at your health of your systems, look at the cybersecurity around it, and make sure you're as healthy and as cyber secure as possible. And then don't stop innovating, right? We all live in a world where innovation benefits us. So always look at moving forward and innovating. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Derek. I would now like to invite all of our speakers back off of mute to engage in a panel discussion and Q&A session. And for the folks listening in, please feel free. There's a Q&A submittal process on the Zoom platform. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see it light up. You can submit your questions there, or you can also submit them via Twitter or any other social media platforms with hashtag ICS_IIoT. So we will move into our questions. Bill submitted one to us. It says, what things can happen as each hour passes before an incident response is made? Would either of you like to address that one?
Yeah, so I can address part of it, I guess. So usually what we're looking at is what can happen is not only lateral spread, but it's more about if you're losing production times, right? So basically what can happen during that time or while you're waiting IR is essentially burning $100 bills out of your pocket, right? So anytime you're down, anytime you're not producing, that becomes a very heavy cost to the business. So that's kind of what we see on our side.
Okay, great. Had another question come in from Sanjay. He said, how can attacks like Triton be avoided or mitigated?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In this case of an attack like Triton or some of the other ones that we looked at, they are, at the end of the day, a traditional, although sophisticated malware attack, right? So then later on at the very last stage to deploy a payload, which will go after the actual OT equipment. So you protect against them in the same way you protect against any proper malware attack by having layered defenses for starters, multiple different levels that you protect and monitor at. So not just on the endpoint, but you want to have on the network side. And as I said, especially in the case of targeted attack, like something like a Triton, you have to work in a world where you assume you're already compromised. Every day, you go into the office assuming, right, my network is compromised, where are the bad guys? And for that, you need very good, especially at the network layer, you need to have very good kind of security solutions in place that let you see any lateral movement and moving, testing of accounts, things like that would move around the network. So you want that both layered defense and also you need to have both the kind of the newer technologies, like more machine learning type approaches, but also some of the older technologies, the static detections and so on, because some of that is going to be cloud-based, which isn't always an option for once you start moving into the OT network. But essentially, we have actually some, in the paper itself, there's about 8 pages on ways we would recommend, like segmenting networks and setting them up and things like that. And it goes a long way to, if you implement any of those, it goes a long way to making that easier to stop those sort of targeted attacks.
I see. Thank you. We had another one come in from Paige. I wonder if you are seeing any attacks from someone local to the plants and refineries. By local, I mean someone not an insider. Mm-hmm. So not necessarily an internal attack, but I guess a regional local attack.
So I can answer a bit on the attacks we have seen. Generally, they either come from not local, so like I said, like the kind of targeted attack type scenarios where it could be the opposite side of the planet. Where you would see a more localized attack would be actually the hacktivist scenario. And that could be as I said, the 15-year-old kid who gets up every morning and looks out at the oil refinery that's down the road, that kind of thing. And then if he is politically decides to go after that target because he sees it every day, he's aware of it, and so on. That's where you might see those type of more localized attacks on something. But the majority of the ones that we would be concerned about would be from further afield.
Great, thank you. One more from Tony. It says, is anyone implementing whitelist microsegmenting today?
So we haven't seen a lot of microsegmentation, mostly because when you implement microsegmentation, you blip networks, right? And these are they need uptime. They need 5 to 9 uptimes when you're doing the network. So it would really take an outage in order to do that microsegmentation on that. We have had some talks and talked to some customers about doing it, and I think we're probably 1 or 2 years away from really getting to that point of starting to implement that for our customers. It is very important, right? So it not only does it protect you better, it drives down the cost because now you don't have to put the same security controls on a tertiary assets than you would on some of your main assets. So there's a lot of benefits there. We haven't seen it all that much as of yet.
Gotcha. Okay. Had a question come in from Sanjay. He said, are the trend micro reports available? I think he's referring to the ones that you referenced in the presentation at the beginning.
Yeah, so all of those reports, they're all available, they're all online. If you search for Trend Micro ICS, you'll get to a page with most of them on it. But if not, they're in the speaker notes as well, which will go out with the consolidated slide deck. So yeah, they're all online and free.
Great. One more come in here. It says, do you think we will see more criminal attacks coming against industries like oil and gas in the near future?
Yeah, so in my case, yes, absolutely. I think in terms of especially things like targeted ransomware, we're seeing more and more targeted ransomware coming in as these big groups who are doing ransomware broadly, let's say, are maturing. They're realizing there's more money to be made in. First of all, they're currently targeting like small and medium businesses, but they're starting to go after enterprise businesses as well. So what they will start to try and do is certainly look for those devices that cannot afford to be offline. And that's where I said things like oil and gas, hospitals, for example, would be another perfect example. And yeah, there's a lot of money to be potentially made there.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Follow the money, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one. This is a good point. It says, my organization is not one of the larger companies in this space, but how much risk am I really under of attack? So kind of pointing towards the smaller enterprise or the smaller organization. What's the threat landscape look like there?
I don't know, Derek, well, I'll give a quick answer to that side first, which is most of the ones that we found were that were vulnerable were in that sort of scale. And there's a lot of opportunistic attackers out there that will go after it. Certainly the financial ones we just mentioned, these are the ones they're going to go after. They're going to go after the easy ones that are very on the internet and in that size. And also they like that sort of size of organization, because if you're a huge mega company, you probably have entire teams of InfoSec, to protect you, and OTs, InfoSec, and so on. If you're in a more middle size, then you have less people to protect you just by the very nature. So you're an easier target. So that mid-size, not just in this industry, but in any industry, is the main target for financial attackers.
Yeah, and to add on to that, we've seen those smaller organizations being more of a test bed as well, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of the attackers, they're getting more sophisticated and learning about OT networks, but especially on the criminal side, they may not understand what an OT network looks like, right? So they won't spend as much time trying to get into one, as once they're in there, they're going to look to understand it. Now, the scary thing about that is they don't know OT networks, so the chance of them breaking something just inadvertently is pretty high as well. So there's a lot of risk in that.
So cyber is not necessarily malicious. Unintended can also do damage. It's an interesting point. Here's another one that just came in as well. It says, what resources would you advise for cybersecurity professionals to convert from IT to OT security? And what topics should be the priority after understanding the business constraints?
Yeah, so for me, I came from the IT background, so I know this very well. It's understanding the connections and the protocols, and then what each one of them do, and then what is necessary within those connections, right? So there's very, very direct latency issues, cybersecurity for OT, that may not translate to IT, so that you have to understand, especially through safety systems, right? So you need to have that trip, and you need to have it trip in the 10 millisecond timeline. So it adds new unique challenges that you may not understand from an IT side of it. So I would understand the networking, understand the protocols, and then understand the latency issues that they have would be my first I guess route to start moving into the OT space.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that one. Sophia just asked us also, how can AI help in protecting OT networks? So anyone have any insight into the world of AI?
Yeah.
We haven't seen AI. Me personally, I haven't seen AI too much in the OT network because everything has to be passive, right? So the thing about AI is it is very much learned, so it can do it on its own. In the OT network, you necessarily don't want things doing it on their own, right? I think there's other applications for that, but I think more what we should be looking at instead of AI is more automation, not automation of processes, but automation of tasks, making tasks more automated. Like if it takes 10 clicks to do something cybersecurity related, build in some automation so it takes 2 clicks, right? So that I see that more than I would see AI in this space.
Got it. Okay, Omar just submitted a question too. It says, besides equipment and machines, data is vital in oil and gas in this big data era. What are some of the threats you foresee in the near future?
So I can jump in on that one. So I think, and this isn't unique to oil and gas, this is just the modern world we're moving into, where in a lot of cases, the data that you have in your company is almost as valuable as just about anything else, even if it's things you produce, right, in some cases, because it can be both sold and leveraged and some kind of proprietary lifeblood that keeps you going. So anything around data is vulnerable by its very nature to extortion. So your data is moving around your network, it's stored somewhere at some stage. And when it's stored, if an attacker gets control of that part, be it a server, the cloud, wherever it is you're storing your data, they can then seize control of that. So the easiest way to do that is encrypt it and then ransom it back to you. So it's a big problem. The more you are reliant on data, arguably the more you are vulnerable to certain attacks like digital extortion type attacks. Ransomware is only one of those. There's plenty of other ones as well to lock you out of systems or expose the data. So if you're living in a world of like in Europe GDPR type issues, they can extort you that they will expose all your data on the internet, so your competitors have it, and you get hit by regulators.
Mm-hmm. Makes good sense. Hatham would like to know, is going cloud have a different security risk for oil and gas? And is it necessary in your opinion?
So I see it necessary in oil and gas. There is risk, right? Anytime you put a connection in, there's risk. But I think there's a lot of rewards, especially for oil and gas. And when you talk about cloud, I'll talk more about backup, right? So we see a lot of backup right now located in the plant, right? So it's locally located. Now, oil and gas, by what they are, is usually in areas of high weather, right? So you really risk losing that and not being able to move your backup to more of a secure, just not secure cybersecure, but just secure from the elements, puts risk, right? And we talk about data and how important it is. You don't want to be losing that. You want to back it. You want to back it up. You want to be able to move it where you need to be. So it's really a risk, and it's really the risk tolerance of your organization, whether you want to move to the cloud or not.
Mm-hmm. And without getting into detail, I'm sure latency and a lot of the other aspects are going to play a big role in that too. Where do you need to crunch the data? All right, we have another question coming in. This is from Sanjay. It says, the perils of automation. We saw the recent Boeing 737 incidents and grounding of all planes globally. As cars, oil platforms, windmills, grids, airplanes, etc., become automated and digitized, we can expect to see malfunctioning and malware attacks. So huge implications for technology and common sense. Looks like more of a comment than a question, but thank you for submitting that, Sanjay. Okay, I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. If anyone else has anything, here's a couple. Okay, how do I know if the OT network is being attacked? So what type of indications can you see, or do you just suffer the consequences after the fact? Anyone have any insight into that?
So I guess knowing, like any network, OT or IT, knowing what your baseline looks like is important. And to have that, you need to have good monitoring systems in place. And not just monitoring systems, but you need to have people who are familiar with what the results of that monitoring looks like, so that you know how your network should be behaving. And then you can search for anomalies. And by the very similar nature, that's also where obviously you can't be expected to see every small little anomaly, something being very stealthy, but at the level of a security solution, it should be able to observe things like that, kind of anomalies and things that you wouldn't expect to see on the network. So there's a lot to be said for especially for a network that doesn't or shouldn't change that often. There's a lot that can be done in terms of things like anomaly detection. But I don't know, Derek, do you have anything else to add into that as well?
Yeah, so in the OT network, it's a little bit more difficult because of the disparate systems within it, right? So usually you have, you may have different controllers, and then on each one of those controllers, you have different security controls on that. So that makes it harder, right? So you're basically looking at 4 different dashboards. So by centralizing your visibility into one centralized place, you'll be able to tell a lot more if there is something happening on your network, just because you don't have to look at 12 different places to get that view.
Mm-hmm. Then a budget question come in. It says, who controls the budgets for IoT security? For example, in healthcare, clinical engineering owns the medical device budget, but that group is hiring cyber people or teaching production people to learn security. Are we seeing the same in the industrial and oil and gas sectors?
Yeah, I can answer that. It's really moving. So I would say, ask me at the end of the year as well, and you might get a different answer. But right now, we see it in 2 different places. Like I mentioned, we see it sitting with at the plant operator level whenever they get a capital investment, whenever they're making a control system upgrade, an HMI upgrade, or even retrofitting some of their turbines or compressors, those type of things. But then we're starting to see in cycle, when I say in cycle, is in between these upgrades or control upgrades. We're starting to see now IT owning that budget because they understand the risks to the business on the plant level. So you're starting to see now that budget from an IT organization or IT security organization flow down to the plant level. So I think it's going to start flowing even more that way, moving into the future.
All right. Well, we'll wrap with one last question. That says, if I could do one OT cybersecurity measure, what would you 2 recommend?
OT measure. I have a hard time picking just one. I don't think one on its own is
You can give
not.
us more than one. That's okay.
Yeah, as I said, one would be read the 8 pages in the actual paper. But no, I think the number one would be very much because it's not a way that people think about it, but scanning your own infrastructure from the outside, right? So you should be aware of what IP addresses you have, or you can figure them out, hopefully, and map them out over time to find what you have that's exposed on the internet. That won't solve all your problems, because as I said, you should also assume attackers are inside already, but it should remove like the scenario, as I said, is 2019. Your stuff shouldn't be that vulnerable on the internet anymore. It'll get rid of that one. And that rules out a lot of the hacktivists completely, because they're not going to go to the full level of necessarily getting all the way in through target attacks. That would be the one thing I would advise everyone, which is to go hack yourself or go scan yourself and find out how exposed you are.
Yep, and
very good.
And from my side, I would say look at the overall health of your network and make sure that your OS is able to be patched, and then stay up to date on your patching, right? I think that's the basic things that we can do to provide security or make sure that you're more secure.
Very good. Well, thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to stay tuned for other educational webcasts brought to you by IIoT World over the next couple of months. We have several topics that should be of interest to a vast majority of our listeners that are tuned in today too. Transforming operations, how IIoT creates real-time visibility for manufacturing will be featured on April 23rd. And we have monetizing IIoT. It's going to be based on use cases in the manufacturing space, and that's dialed in for May. No definitive date yet, but stay tuned for a finite date on that front too. Special thanks to Robert and Derek for their engagement today and their excellent input into the presentations and the Q&A as well. And special thanks to Trend Micro, our sponsor for this educational session. Check out our upcoming events where our analysts will be present around the globe. And feel free to subscribe to our newsletters or YouTube channels, or follow us on Twitter at IIoT_world. This concludes our program for today. Thanks for joining us.